The true power of the ring. Why no one could wield the One Ring.
The One Ring promised power to everyone, but everyone who put it on lost. Gandalf didn't dare touch it. Galadriel was tempted for a heartbeat before pulling back. Boromir gave his life for it. So why did this ring serve no one but its maker? If that question keeps you up at night, subscribe to Narrative Error, because today we're cracking the deepest secret of Middle-earth's most dangerous object.
The most dangerous thing in Middle-earth was not a sword. It was not a dragon, not even an army. It was a small, plain-looking band of gold. But what made this ring dangerous was never its physical force. What made it dangerous was its ability to find the darkest desire inside whoever wore it, amplify that desire, and ultimately turn the wearer into its slave. The One Ring was the greatest paradox in Middle-earth's history. It promised immense power, yet the only person who could truly wield that power was the one who had forged it, Sauron. How is that possible? How could an object promise power to everyone and deliver it to no one?
The answer was hidden in the ring's very nature, and to understand that nature, you had to understand Sauron himself.
To grasp the One Ring, you first had to know how and why it was created. In the Second Age, Sauron forged this ring in the fires of Orodruin, now Doom, deep in Mordor. But this was no ordinary act of craft. Sauron poured a great part of his own will, his power, and his very essence into this object. Tolkien wrote it plainly. The ring was an extension of Sauron's native power, almost a living piece of him. Just as Morgoth dispersed his own essence into the fabric of Arda, what Tolkien called Morgoth's ring, Sauron poured his being into this band of gold. The move made the ring extraordinarily powerful, but it also bound Sauron to it permanently.
As long as the ring existed, Sauron could never be fully destroyed. But without the ring, Sauron could never reach his full strength. The two were locked together. This was a calculated risk on Sauron's part. He knew that so long as the ring was in his hand, he would be without rival. He never once factored in the possibility of losing it.
The ring's core function was to establish absolute dominion over the bearers of the other rings of power. The 3 rings of the elves, the 7 rings of the dwarves, and the 9 rings of men, all were meant to fall under the One Ring's sway. Sauron had worked alongside the elven smiths of Eregion, Celebrimbor and his kin, teaching them the art of ring-making. He presented himself as Onatar, the Lord of Gifts, hiding his true design beneath the guise of shared knowledge. The moment he secretly forged the One Ring, he gained the capacity to dominate the wearers of all the others. This was the ring's primary power, domination, seizing the will of others and bending them to his purpose.
It was a power that perfectly mirrored Sauron's own nature, for Sauron had always been a Maya obsessed with order and control. That was why he had joined Morgoth in the first place, not for chaos, but for absolute order. And the ring was that desire made manifest.
So what happened when the ring fell into someone else's hands? This is where Tolkien's genius came into play. The ring manifested differently depending on the bearer's nature. When a hobbit put it on, it turned him invisible. Because hobbits possessed little spiritual capacity, the ring pulled them out of the physical world and into the wraith world, the unseen. But invisibility was not the ring's true power. It was merely a side effect, much like getting burned is not the sun's purpose when you fly too close. The ring actually offered power proportional to the bearer's spiritual stature. To an ordinary hobbit like Frodo, it granted invisibility and occasional contact with the eye of Sauron.
But if a being of great power, Gandalf or Galadriel, were to wear it, the ring would open entirely different doors. And what waited behind those doors was not freedom, it was bondage.
Tolkien addressed this question several times, both in his letters and within the story itself.
The possibility of Gandalf wielding the ring was one of the book's most critical tension points. When Frodo offered the ring to him, Gandalf recoiled, almost in panic. Why did he refuse? Because he knew exactly what the ring's power would do to him. The ring took whatever power its bearer already possessed, then warped and magnified it. Gandalf was a Maya. He carried enormous spiritual might, but when he was sent from Valinor, the greater part of that power had been deliberately restrained. The ring could have lifted that restraint. It would have transformed Gandalf into an instrument of overwhelming dominion.
But here was the subtlety. That power would not have been shaped by Gandalf's own will. It would have been shaped by Sauron's. The ring carried its maker's intent. Domination, control, subjugation, these concepts were woven into the ring's very fabric. No matter how good Gandalf's intentions, the longer he used the ring, the more he would become a prisoner of those concepts. The power he seized to avert an immediate danger would step by step become the power that defined him.
Tolkien laid this out with striking clarity. If Gandalf had claimed the ring, he might have overthrown Sauron at first. He might even have saved Middle-earth. But then what? Under the ring's influence, Gandalf would have begun imposing his own vision. Small steps at first, guiding people onto the right path, preserving peace, enforcing justice, all with noble justifications. But each intervention would demand the next. Everything that began with good intentions would curdle into tyranny. The power he took to save Middle-earth would make him Middle-earth's new master. A new Dark Lord would arise to replace Sauron, but this time a far more dangerous one, because he would believe himself righteous, a tyrant ruling behind a mask of mercy.
Tolkien constructed this scenario deliberately as the deepest form of tragedy. The most dangerous kind of evil is the evil that believes it is good. That theme was the backbone of Tolkien's entire body of work.
For Galadriel, the situation was no different. In the mirror scene in Lothlorien, when Frodo offered her the ring, Galadriel was seized for a moment by the vision it dangled before her. Tolkien described that instant almost as a physical transformation. Galadriel seemed to grow, filled with light, and declared that she would become a queen, beautiful and terrible, and all would love her and despair. Those few seconds captured the ring's operating mechanism perfectly. The ring had found Galadriel's deepest desire, to protect Middle-earth, to preserve its beauty, to resist the ravages of time. These were noble desires, forged over thousands of years of exile and loss, but the ring would have twisted those noble desires beyond recognition.
Protection would have become control. Preservation would have become imprisonment. Resistance would have become tyranny. Galadriel saw it clearly, and she refused the ring. "I pass the test," she said. "I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel." That moment was one of the most powerful character beats in Tolkien's entire work. True power was measured by the capacity to refuse. Boromir's fate was the most painful illustration of what the ring did to ordinary mortals. Boromir was not a bad man. He was a courageous warrior who defended Gondor and laid his life on the line for his people. He had grown up in the shadow of his father, Denethor, always with something to prove. The ring found exactly that pressure point, his terror that Gondor would fall, and his hunger to save it single-handedly. The ring whispered to him, "Use me, save Gondor, defeat Sauron, prove your worth to your father." Boromir did not resist that voice, because the voice was his own. That was the ring's most insidious feature. It did not feel like an outside temptation. It felt like the bearer's own thought.
It seeped into the will, disguising itself as reason. When Boromir tried to take the ring at Amon Hen, he had already become a prisoner of his own fears and desires. That scene proved the ring was not a tool of physical force, it was a psychological weapon.
The dwarves' relationship with the rings presented an entirely different dynamic. The 7 dwarf rings did not turn their bearers into wraiths. They did not make them nazgul. The dwarves' nature was resistant to that kind of corruption. Tolkien wrote that the dwarves had been created by Aule through a separate act of making, and therefore possessed a spiritual constitution unlike any other race. Their stubbornness, their hardness, their fierce independence shielded them against outside domination. Sauron's direct control could not fully claim them, and this frustrated him greatly. But the rings corrupted the dwarves in a different way. They inflamed their greed.
The dwarves' natural love of gold and precious gems, under the ring's influence, swelled into uncontrollable obsession. The bearers of the 7 amassed vast hoards, but those hoards brought them no peace. Thror's gold sickness in Erebor, the reckless delving into the depths of Moria, all of it was rooted in the insatiable avarice the rings had stoked. The rings could not dominate the dwarves outright, but they rotted them slowly from within.
The bearers of the 9 rings of men met the most tragic end of all. They became the nazgul, neither dead nor alive, shadows trapped between 2 worlds, wholly enslaved to Sauron's will. In Tolkien's universe, men were the most fragile of the free peoples. They were mortal, and that mortality left them defenseless against the ring's deepest lure, the promise of defying death. The 9 had been mighty lords, kings and warriors. Tolkien implied that at least 3 among them were of Númenórean blood. The rings granted them long life, extraordinary power, and invisibility, but in return they claimed their souls. Over decades, over centuries, these lords slowly faded. Their bodies dissolved, their wills evaporated, their identities vanished. The existence of the Nazgul laid bare the ring's true price. The ring took back everything it gave, and then some. It promised power, but the cost of that power was the total surrender of free will. It granted long life, but that life became a living death. The Nazgul could not even remember their own names.
So, why were hobbits so resistant? Tolkien never answered the question directly, but he left powerful clues. The hobbits' strength lay, paradoxically, in their lack of strength. They had no desire to conquer the world. They harbored no lust for dominion. They had no grand plans, no strategies, no imperial ambitions. The ring found its target by seeking the bearer's deepest desire and magnifying it. But what was a hobbit's deepest desire? Second breakfast, a fine garden, a warm hearth, a peaceful supper. The rings struggled to corrupt those desires because they were not the kind that could be twisted into tyranny. How would you turn a hobbit's longing for a nice garden into world domination? That was why Frodo could carry the ring for hundreds of miles. That was why Bilbo could use the ring for decades and still give it up voluntarily, the only person in Tolkien's entire legendarium to do so. But the critical point was this. Even Bilbo struggled at the very end, and Gandalf had to intervene. And Frodo, at the crack of doom, refused to let it go. There was no such thing as absolute resistance to the ring. There was only delay, because sooner or later, the ring would break everyone. Samwise Gamgee was perhaps the ring's most fascinating test case. At Cirith Ungol, believing Frodo to be dead, Sam took the ring and briefly wore it. The ring offered him a vision, a vast garden, all of Mordor carpeted with flowers, Sam presiding over it as a great gardener lord. For one moment, Sam was tempted, and then he came back to himself and very nearly laughed, because he knew he was just a gardener. The idea of turning the whole world into a garden struck him as absurd. He felt he was neither worthy nor capable of such a thing. That scene read like a summary of Tolkien's entire philosophy. Humility was the greatest antidote to power. A soul that claimed no greatness could not surrender to the ring's fantasy of greatness.
Sam wore the ring and gave it up easily because the vision it offered simply didn't match who he was. Tolkien located heroism not in sword-swinging knights, but in a loyal, humble gardener.
The One Ring's deepest secret was this. It was not actually an instrument of power. It was a trap, a mirror trap, a mechanism that showed the bearer his own desires and drowned him in them. Even in a world without Sauron, the ring by itself would have been impotent, because its power flowed from Sauron's will. The ring appeared to grant power to the bearer, but what it really did was pull the bearer into Sauron's order, into Sauron's lair of reality. Every use of the ring drew the wearer a little closer to Sauron's world, the Wraith world, the unseen.
Frodo's gradual fading over the course of the journey, his growing disconnection from the world, his inability to eat or drink, the wounds from the Morgul blade and Shelob's sting that never fully healed, these were not random details. They were the physical symptoms of the ring's true effect. The ring did not take, it slowly dissolved its bearer.
What Tolkien was really saying through the One Ring went far beyond the cliché that absolute power corrupts absolutely. He was interrogating the nature of power itself. Does power define the one who wields it, or does the wielder define the power? The One Ring gave a definitive answer. Power always carries the will of its source. The ring came from Sauron, and wherever it went, whoever held it, it spread Sauron's will. Using it for good was impossible because malice was built into its very structure. That was why the ring had to be destroyed, not used, not hidden, not cast into the depths of the sea, because even at the bottom of the sea, Sauron's will would endure, and sooner or later, the ring would find its way back to the surface.
Elrond stated this plainly at the Council of Rivendell. No power existed that could conceal, protect, or contain the ring forever. The only solution was annihilation.
That was why Frodo's task was no ordinary act of heroism. He was a character who had to possess power and then reject it. He saved the world not by wielding power, but by destroying it. Tolkien, writing in the shadow of the Second World War, understood on a deep level that the greatest weapon against the seduction of power was the refusal to possess it. He had watched the atomic bomb debates closely and had seen firsthand how technological might could spiral beyond control. The melting of the ring in the fires of Orodruin was not merely the ending of a fantasy novel. It was a hope, painful, costly, and hard-won, that the lust for dominion could be destroyed.
And perhaps the most important lesson the ring left behind was this. True power was never inside an object. True power was hidden in the courage to throw that object into the fire. The ring melted. Sauron fell. But the question the ring asked still stands. If someone offered you limitless power, could you throw it into the fire? Frodo couldn't. Gandalf didn't even try. Galadriel pulled back at the last second. Maybe the most honest answer is that none of us can know for certain, and maybe that is exactly what Tolkien was trying to tell us. If this video made you think, don't forget to subscribe to Narrative Error.